Moving into my dream home in Willowbrook Estates should have been one of the happiest days of my life. After months of house hunting, mortgage applications, and inspections, I finally had the keys to my beautiful three-bedroom colonial on Maple Street. The neighborhood looked perfect with its manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and that suburban charm I had always wanted. What I didn't expect was to meet Karen Henderson, the self-appointed queen of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, within the first hour of moving in. I was unloading boxes from my moving truck when I noticed a woman marching across the street toward me. She was probably in her mid-50s, wearing a bright pink tracksuit that somehow managed to look both expensive and ridiculous at the same time. Her bleached blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt, and she carried herself with the kind of artificial authority that screamed middle management gone wrong. Karen, with that tone that suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor by even speaking to me. Excuse me, but are you aware that this is a private residential neighborhood with very strict moving regulations? I set down the box I was carrying and turned to face her with what I hoped was a friendly smile. Me, trying to stay polite. Hi there, I'm Mike Thompson. I just bought this house and I'm moving in today. Nice to meet you. She looked me up and down like I was some kind of suspicious character rather than a new neighbor. Karen, not bothering with pleasantries. I'm Karen Henderson, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. And I need to inform you that all moving activities must be scheduled and approved through the HOA office at least 72 hours in advance. Do you have your moving permit? Moving permit? I had never heard of such a thing in my life, and I had moved plenty of times before. Me, still trying to keep things friendly, I wasn't aware I needed a permit to move into my own house. The closing was yesterday, and this seemed like the logical next step. Karen's eyes narrowed like I had just confessed to planning a bank robbery. Karen, getting more agitated, this is exactly the kind of attitude that destroys property values and community standards. The HOA covenant clearly states that all moving activities must be coordinated to minimize disruption to residents. Large trucks are not permitted on weekends without proper authorization. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:30 on a Saturday afternoon, hardly what anyone would call an unreasonable hour for moving. The moving truck wasn't blocking any driveways or fire hydrants, and my movers were being respectful and quiet. Me, with a slight edge creeping into my voice. Well, Karen, I appreciate you letting me know about the rules, but since I'm already here and the truck is already loaded, I think the most practical thing is to finish getting moved in today. I'll be sure to check with the HOA office about any future needs. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Karen's face turned a shade of red that clashed horribly with her pink tracksuit. Karen, her voice rising, practical? Practical? Do you think the rules don't apply to you just because you're new? I have been the president of this HOA for 7 years, and I have never seen such blatant disrespect for community standards. At this point, I was starting to realize that this woman might be completely unhinged, but I was determined not to let her ruin my moving day. Me, staying calm but firm. Look, I understand you take your HOA responsibilities seriously, but I'm not breaking any laws here. I'm moving into a house I legally own during reasonable daylight hours with a properly licensed and insured moving company. If there are fines associated with not having a permit, I'll gladly pay them after I finish moving. Karen looked like she was about to have a stroke. She pulled out her phone and started waving it around dramatically. Karen, practically shrieking now, this is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. If you think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and ignore our established procedures, you are sorely mistaken. I'm documenting this entire conversation for the HOA violation report. She started taking pictures of me, my moving truck, and my house like she was gathering evidence for a criminal trial. The moving crew, 2 guys who had probably seen their share of neighborhood drama, just kept working and tried to ignore the spectacle. Me, with deliberate calm. You're welcome to take all the pictures you want, Karen. Just please stay out of the way so we can finish this safely. That was when Karen really lost it. Karen, now shouting loud enough for the whole street to hear. Don't you dare tell me where I can and cannot stand in my own neighborhood. This is harassment and intimidation, and I will not tolerate it. The irony was almost too much to bear. She was the one screaming, taking unwanted photos, and making threats, but somehow I was the one harassing her. Me, with a slight smile. I think you might have that backwards, but okay. Karen spent the next 20 minutes lurking around my property line, taking more pictures and making phone calls to what I assumed were other HOA board members. Every few minutes, she would shout something about violations and consequences, but I just kept directing the movers and unpacking boxes. I had learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with bullies was to refuse to engage with their drama. By 5 o'clock, the moving truck was empty and driving away. I thought that would be the end of my encounter with Karen Henderson, but I was wrong. As I was carrying the last few boxes from my car to the front door, she came marching back over with what appeared to be an official-looking document. Karen, with fake sweetness that was somehow worse than her shouting. "Well, Mike, I hope you've enjoyed your little rule-breaking adventure today, because it's going to cost you. This is your official HOA violation notice for unauthorized moving activities, disruption of neighborhood peace, and failure to obtain proper permits." She handed me a piece of paper that looked like it had been designed by someone who watched too many legal dramas. It was full of whereas clauses and numbered subsections, but the bottom line was clear. They were fining me $300 for moving into my own house. Me, reading the notice with genuine amusement. "This is fascinating, Karen. Tell me, how exactly does the HOA have the authority to fine me for activities that took place before I was even technically a member?" Her triumphant expression flickered for just a moment. "Karen, less confident now, the covenant is binding on all property owners regardless of when they take possession. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse." I folded the notice and put it in my back pocket. Me, still calm. "Well, I guess we'll see about that. In the meantime, thanks for the warm welcome to the neighborhood." Karen stomped back to her house, and I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen Henderson made it her personal mission to make my life miserable. She left more violation notices on my door for things like having my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, parking my car in my own driveway instead of my garage, and having a small flower bed that was apparently 3 inches wider than HOA regulations allowed. Each notice came with increasingly dramatic language about property values and community standards. She also started what I could only describe as surveillance activities, walking past my house multiple times per day and taking pictures of anything she thought might be a violation. It was like having my own personal paparazzi, except instead of being famous, I was just guilty of existing in a house that happened to be in Karen's line of sight. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after I had moved in. I had been working late and got home around 7:30. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk in front of my house with her phone out, clearly recording me. I parked in my garage as usual and walked to my mailbox to get the day's mail. Karen, shouting from the sidewalk, "Stop right there. You are trespassing on HOA property, and I'm calling the police." I looked around, completely confused. I was standing in my own driveway, next to my own mailbox, in front of my own house. Me, genuinely puzzled. "Karen, this is my property. I'm getting my mail." Karen, now dialing 911. "That mailbox is located on the community easement, which makes it HOA property. You don't have permission to be there." I had to hand it to her. That was creative even by Karen's standards. Me, with growing disbelief. "Are you seriously calling the police because I'm getting my mail from my own mailbox?" Karen, speaking into her phone. "Yes, hello. I need to report a trespassing incident at 42 Maple Street in Willowbrook Estates. There's a man on HOA property who refuses to leave despite repeated requests." This was insane. I stood there holding my mail while Karen gave the dispatcher a completely fictional account of what was happening. According to her version, I was some kind of aggressive intruder who had been harassing residents and destroying property. She even managed to work in a claim that I had threatened her, which was particularly impressive since I had barely said 10 words to her in the past 5 minutes. While we waited for the police to arrive, Karen continued her performance. She walked around taking more pictures and muttering loudly about how people like me were ruining the neighborhood. I just leaned against my car and checked my mail, which included 2 more HOA violation notices that had apparently been delivered since morning. Officer Martinez arrived about 15 minutes later. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with his share of neighborhood disputes. He listened politely, while Karen launched into her prepared speech about trespassing and harassment and community standards. Karen, in her most authoritative voice, "Officer, This man has been systematically violating HOA regulations since the day he moved in. He refuses to follow proper procedures. He's disrupted the peace of our community, and now he's trespassing on association property. I demand that you arrest him immediately." Officer Martinez looked from Karen to me, then at my house, then at the mailbox that was clearly marked with my address. Officer Martinez, with professional patience: "Ma'am, can you explain to me exactly how someone can trespass on their own property?" Karen launched into a complicated explanation about easements and community property and HOA authority that seemed to confuse even her. Meanwhile, I pulled out my phone and showed Officer Martinez the photos I had been taking of Karen's surveillance activities over the past few weeks. Me, staying respectful: "Officer, this woman has been harassing me since the day I moved in. She's taken hundreds of photos of my house and my activities. She's left fake violation notices on my door almost daily, and now she's called you out here because she doesn't like seeing me get my own mail." Officer Martinez examined the violation notices I handed him, and his expression grew more skeptical by the minute. Officer Martinez, reading one of the notices: "Ma'am, it says here that you fined this gentleman for having a car in his driveway. Is that actually against HOA rules?" Karen's confident demeanor started to crack. Karen, getting defensive: "All vehicles must be parked in garages overnight to maintain the aesthetic standards of the community." Officer Martinez, looking around at all the cars parked in driveways up and down the street: "And yet I see vehicles in driveways at almost every house on this block." That was when Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of admitting that maybe she had been overzealous, she doubled down. "Karen," her voice rising again, "those residents have received variance approvals for their parking situations. This man has consistently refused to follow proper procedures or show any respect for community authority." Officer Martinez looked at me with what might have been sympathy. Officer Martinez: "Sir, do you have documentation showing you own this property?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I had taken of my deed and closing documents. "Me, I closed on this house 3 weeks ago. I have all the paperwork inside if you need to see the originals." Officer Martinez, turning back to Karen: "Ma'am, I need to see some documentation of this HOA authority you keep mentioning. Do you have anything showing that this mailbox area is actually association property rather than part of his lot?" Karen fumbled with her folder of papers for several minutes before admitting that she didn't have the actual property survey with her. Karen, getting more flustered: "The documentation is all on file at the HOA office, but I shouldn't need to carry around legal documents to enforce basic community standards." Officer Martinez was clearly losing patience. Officer Martinez: "Ma'am, you called 911 to report a trespassing incident, but you don't have any evidence that trespassing actually occurred. This gentleman is standing on what appears to be his own property, getting mail from what appears to be his own mailbox. Unless you can show me documentation proving otherwise, there's no crime here." Karen looked like she was about to explode. Karen, practically screaming: "This is ridiculous. I am the HOA president. I have authority over this entire community. You can't just ignore HOA regulations because you don't understand them." That was when Officer Martinez's patience finally ran out. Officer Martinez, with a stern tone: "Ma'am, HOA regulations are civil matters, not criminal ones. Filing false police reports, on the other hand, is a criminal matter. I suggest you be very careful about how you proceed." The color drained from Karen's face as the implications hit her. She had just spent 20 minutes telling a police officer that I was committing crimes that she couldn't prove, in a situation where she was clearly the aggressor. Karen, backpedaling frantically: "I never said it was criminal. I just wanted him to follow the rules like everyone else." Officer Martinez closed his notepad and looked directly at Karen. Officer Martinez: "Ma'am, calling 911 because your neighbor got his mail is not an appropriate use of emergency services. If you have civil disputes about HOA matters, you need to handle them through civil courts or mediation, not by involving police officers." He turned to me with a much friendlier expression. Officer Martinez: "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're obviously not breaking any laws by existing on your own property. If this harassment continues, you might want to consider documenting it and speaking with an attorney about your options." After Officer Martinez left, Karen stood on the sidewalk looking like someone had just told her that Santa Claus wasn't real. I started to head inside, but curiosity got the better of me. Me, unable to resist, You know, Karen, that was quite a performance. Do you think maybe it's time to dial back the HOA enforcement just a little bit? Karen's shock turned back into rage almost instantly. Karen, pointing dramatically, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. You think you're so smart, but I've been dealing with troublemakers like you for years. The HOA board will hear about every single one of your violations, and we will take appropriate action. Me, with a slight smile, I'm sure you will, Karen. I'm sure you will. What Karen didn't know was that I had been doing some research of my own over the past 3 weeks. It turns out that when you're getting fake violation notices on a daily basis, you tend to become very motivated to understand exactly what authority the people issuing them actually have. And what I discovered was fascinating. The next morning, I made a few phone calls. The first was to the Willowbrook Estates HOA management company, where I spoke with a very apologetic woman named Jennifer who explained that Karen Henderson had been generating an unusual number of violation reports lately, and that several other residents had complained about her aggressive enforcement tactics. My second call was to the county clerk's office, where I learned some very interesting facts about property boundaries and easements in my neighborhood. My third call was to a real estate attorney named David Chun, who specialized in HOA disputes and was very intrigued by the story I told him. By the end of the day, I had a much clearer picture of the legal landscape. Karen Henderson had been operating under some very creative interpretations of HOA authority, many of which had no basis in the actual covenant documents. More importantly, several of her enforcement actions appeared to violate state laws governing homeowner associations. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. Karen had sent me a formal notice requiring my attendance to address my pattern of violations and disrespectful behavior. The notice included a threat of additional fines and possible legal action if I didn't appear. I showed up 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents and Attorney Chin's business card in my pocket. The community center was a small building that looked like it had been decorated by someone with a serious beige addiction. There were about 20 folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the board members sat. Karen was already there, wearing what appeared to be her most professional outfit, a navy blue blazer that looked like it came from a discount store and a silk scarf that was trying way too hard to be elegant. She had a stack of papers in front of her that I assumed contained her evidence of my various crimes against suburban aesthetics. The other board members were exactly what you'd expect. Bob Miller, a retired accountant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Susan Wright, a pleasant-looking woman in her 60s who seemed genuinely concerned about community issues, and David Park, a younger guy who appeared to be texting under the table. Karen called the meeting to order with all the ceremony of someone who thought she was running the United Nations Security Council. After some brief administrative business, she announced that the main item on the agenda was addressing the ongoing compliance issues with the resident at 42 Maple Street. Karen, reading from her prepared statement, the board has documented numerous violations of community standards by Michael Thompson, including unauthorized moving activities, improper vehicle storage, landscaping noncompliance, and most recently, aggressive behavior toward HOA officials and abuse of emergency services. She spent the next 10 minutes reading through every violation notice she had issued, complete with dates, times, and photographic evidence. It was actually pretty impressive as presentations go, except for the small problem that most of it was completely made up. When Karen finished her presentation, she turned to me with the expression of a prosecutor who was confident she had just delivered a knockout blow. Karen, with fake concern, Mr. Thompson, the board is prepared to work with you to resolve these issues, but we need to see a commitment to following community standards going forward. Are you prepared to pay the outstanding fines and agree to proper procedures for the future? I stood up and pulled out my folder. Me, with calm confidence. Actually, Karen, I think there are a few things the board should know before making any decisions. I handed copies of my research to each board member and began my own presentation. It turns out that the HOA covenant for Willowbrook Estates was much more limited in scope than Karen had been pretending. Most of the violations she had cited were either completely outside the association's authority or were being applied in ways that violated state HOA laws. More importantly, I had discovered that Karen had been issuing violation notices and collecting fines without proper board approval, which was a significant breach of her fiduciary duties as president. The other board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as I walked through the documentation. Me, maintaining a professional tone. So to summarize, it appears that Mrs. Henderson has been operating outside her authority in several key areas, has been issuing invalid fines, and has been misrepresenting HOA regulations to residents. I think the board needs to consider whether this is the kind of leadership that serves the community's best interests. Karen looked like someone had just slapped her with a fish. Karen, sputtering, this is outrageous. Everything I've done has been in strict accordance with my duties as HOA president. This man is clearly trying to deflect attention from his own violations by attacking the integrity of the board. Bob Miller cleared his throat and looked directly at Karen. Bob, with obvious discomfort. Karen, did you get board approval for these fines before issuing them? Karen's face went through several shades of red before she answered. Karen, defensive, the president has discretionary authority to address urgent compliance issues. Waiting for full board meetings would make enforcement impossible. Susan Wright spoke up for the first time. Susan, looking concerned. But Karen, our bylaws specifically require board approval for any fines over $50. Some of these are for $300 or more. David Park finally looked up from his phone. David, sounding confused. And what's this about threatening to have someone arrested for getting their mail? That seems kind of extreme. Karen realized that the meeting was not going the way she had planned. Karen, getting more agitated, you don't understand the full context of this situation. This man has been deliberately defiant from day one. He moved in without proper permits. He's consistently violated parking regulations, and he's shown complete disrespect for community authority. I pulled out my phone and showed the board the pictures I had taken of Karen's surveillance activities. Me, still calm. I've documented Mrs. Henderson taking photographs of my house and activities on dozens of occasions over the past month. I've also recorded several instances where she's made threats about legal action and police involvement. I think the question isn't whether I've been disrespectful, but whether this kind of harassment is what the community wants from its HOA leadership. The room fell silent for a moment. Bob Miller looked at the documents again and shook his head. Bob, to Karen, I have to say, this doesn't look good. If even half of what's documented here is accurate, we have some serious problems. Karen stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backwards. Karen, practically shouting, I have given 7 years of my life to this community. 7 years of making sure property values stay high and standards are maintained. And this is the thanks I get? Some newcomer comes in and undermines everything I've worked for, and you're taking his side? Susan Wright tried to calm the situation. Susan, gently. Karen, nobody's taking sides. We're just trying to understand what's been happening and make sure we're following proper procedures. Karen, her voice getting higher and more shrill. Proper procedures? I'll tell you about proper procedures. Proper procedures are what kept this neighborhood from turning into a slum while the rest of you were too busy to pay attention. Proper procedures are what made your property values go up 15% in the last 5 years. David Park looked confused again. David, wait, didn't property values go up because of the new shopping center and the school district ratings? I don't think HOA enforcement really drives real estate prices that much. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Karen whirled around to face David with the fury of someone who had just been told that their life's work was meaningless. Karen, screaming now, you don't know anything about community management. None of you do. You just show up to meetings and complain when things aren't perfect, but you have no idea what it takes to maintain standards. Bob Miller banged a coffee mug on the table like a makeshift gavel. Bob, trying to restore order. Karen, please sit down. We need to discuss this calmly. Karen, completely losing it. Calm? You want me to be calm while this outsider destroys everything I've built? Fine. You want to side with him? You can run this HOA without me. Karen grabbed her papers and stormed toward the door, but Bob Miller called after her. Bob, with authority. Karen, if you leave this meeting, we'll have to hold a vote on your position as president. Karen stopped dead in her tracks. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely scared rather than angry. Karen, her voice shaking, you wouldn't dare. Susan Wright spoke up again, and this time her voice had steel in it. Susan, firmly. Karen, after what we've heard tonight, I think we have to seriously consider whether new leadership might be in the community's best interest. Karen looked around the room like a cornered animal. The other residents who had been quietly watching the drama were all staring at her, and their expressions ranged from disapproval to embarrassment. Karen, desperately, you can't do this to me. I am this HOA. Without me, this whole community would fall apart. Bob Miller pulled out his copy of the HOA bylaws and flipped to a marked page. Bob, reading, according to Section 12.4, any board member can be removed by a majority vote of the current board if they are found to have acted outside their authority or in violation of their fiduciary duties. David Park nodded. David, suddenly engaged. Based on what we've heard tonight, I think we have grounds for that kind of vote. Susan Wright looked directly at Karen with what might have been sympathy. Susan, sadly. Karen, I think you've lost perspective on what this job is supposed to be about. We're here to serve the community, not to be community rulers. Karen's face went completely white as the reality of the situation hit her. After 7 years of wielding HOA authority like her personal kingdom, she was about to be dethroned by the very people she thought she controlled. Karen, her voice barely a whisper, this can't be happening. Bob Miller called for the vote, and it wasn't even close. 3-0, with Karen abstaining on her own removal. Just like that, Karen Henderson's reign as HOA president was over.